I think in some ways it's become a kind of habit of thought. It's almost like a meme. It's a way that people process information about the world, which is this idea that you have states on the one hand and markets on the other hand, and that capitalism is associated with markets and socialism is associated with the state. Now you can trace this back very obviously to the divide between the US and the USSR, where there was this, very clear dividing line. You have a free market capitalist society on the one hand and then a centrally planned socialist society on the other hand. But it was also very, very central to the neoliberal revolution of the 1980s. So this was the kind of transformation of economic thinking driven by a number of prominent academics and policymakers, culminating in the election of leaders like Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, Pinochet in Chile. And their thesis was basically that during the post-war period, when we had this kind of social democratic model, the state had become too big. And that was in the words of Hayek, who was one of the kind of foremost among these thinkers, leading us down the road to serfdom. So he took this divide between the US and the USSR and said this is a divide that is all about the role of the state in society. So when you have a state that becomes too big and that kind of overwhelms the market, it inevitably leads to authoritarianism and oppression. And this argument was, I suppose in some ways was rooted in the common sense of the time, but it was also rooted in a lot of people's experience of what the social democratic model looked like. Because this was a form of leftism that had kind of, it really dominated. It was the most successful that the left had ever been, certainly in the Western world. It, gave us social democracy, it gave us the NHS, it gave us big nationalized corporations and all those sorts of things. But there were thinkers at the time, like, for example, Tony Benn, who said that this socialism that we have built for ourselves now, or this social democracy, it cannot be lasting because it has not resulted in a transformation of people's daily lives to a significant enough extent, because it hasn't resulted in an expansion of human freedom, because it hasn't resulted in a kind of deepening of democracy and a feeling that people would have of kind of power over their lives. Instead, it has resulted in this kind of larger state that is doing a lot of things for a lot of people and making people's lives better. But that power hasn't really trickled down, I suppose, to most people. So this neoliberal critique, which was like, the state has gotten too big, we need more market, it really embedded itself until it became common sense, because they did what you should do with a good political message if you want it to stick, which is repeat it over and over and over again until you are so bored of hearing it. This is, by the way, the exact advice that Cameron and Osborne had about fixing the roof while the sun is shining and we're all going to have to make sacrifices. You repeat that over and over again, there's no money left, until it just becomes common sense and people realize it, despite the fact that it is categorically not true. It becomes a way that you organize your thinking about the world. And this is what happened with the kind of state-market divide. The issue is that it's not true. The transformation that we saw in the 1980s under neoliberalism didn't result in a shrinking of the state to create more space for the market. It simply resulted in a shift of power within society and therefore a change in the nature of what the state was doing. So states didn't really become smaller under neoliberalism. Under certain measures, state spending fell, but state power expanded in a lot of areas. You saw that in the 1980s with the kind of brutal repression of strikers, for example, but all the way through to the financial crisis and, all the regulation that had been put in place to manage the finance sector up to that point. You saw it during COVID. Big states making significant interventions in the economy, but those interventions were geared not towards making ordinary people's lives better, but to shoring up the power of elites and generally the power of large financial organizations, and during the pandemic, big corporations, which got an extraordinary amount of support from governments. So this narrative, which was, we're going to make you all feel free by shrinking the state and expanding the role of the market in your life, is not what happened, but it was an extremely powerful ideological move that allowed people, or kind of made people equate the reduction in spending on, the NHS, public services, benefits, etc., and the rise of corporate power with freedom. And in fact, it's given us the opposite of freedom, because most people, if you ask them, particularly people in positions of disadvantage, how much power do you feel like you have in your own life? how much agency do you have over the things that are happening to you in your workplace, in your community, over the big events that are taking place in this country? They will say very little, because basically their lives are controlled by big corporations at work, big financial institutions when it comes to lending and borrowing, and governments that have very little accountability when it comes to everything else.
And you know, the book sort of lays out your theory, but then is really quite dense with examples. And one of the examples you use is Boeing, which I think is a great example in synthesizing everything you've been saying about public-private, the public-private spheres of power in terms of the free market and control. So why don't you just sort of briefly talk about how Boeing fits into this system which you've described?
I'm glad you asked that, because this is the point at which I earn my abstraction, although I'm pretty sure I'm supposed to be doing it the other way around, but whatever. You guys seem to be engaged enough. So the Boeing example is really fascinating, and I like to contrast it with another example, again from the 1970s, about kind of democratic production in another aerospace company called Lucas Aerospace in the UK. But the Boeing example is fascinating. Many of you will have seen that Boeing has been in the news recently. There have been doors that have blown out of Boeing planes mid-flight. There currently at the moment in the US, there's a big strike going on. There have been whistleblowers coming forward and saying Boeing is manufacturing planes in a way that is unsafe. That is something that has been going on for quite some time now. But if you think back to 2018 and 2019, there were two significant plane crashes in which nearly 350 people died, both involving Boeing 737 MAX planes. Now, what had happened is that Boeing had created a plane that was dynamically unstable, basically, and they'd done this to make the plane bigger, to allow it to fit on more passengers, to make it more attractive to their customers. And they had created a solution to this problem, which was a software solution that caused the plane's nose to tilt down automatically whenever this problem started to arise. And the pilots weren't told about this piece of software. They weren't trained on it, because if they'd had to be trained on it, then that would have cost the airline companies a lot of money. And Boeing agreed with the airline companies, you will be able to take this plane and you will not have to retrain your pilots. So what happened in both these cases is this system was activated, the plane's nose started to tilt down, and it was basically, the engines were on and it was diving straight into the ground. So you had two massive plane crashes, astonishing levels of force that took place in both. Initially, Boeing tried to blame the pilots for what happened. But as it turns out, they had been kind of fighting against this system for the entire plane journey. And then it transpired that this software fix had been put in place to get around this significant problem with the plane's design. And it had all been about this transformation in Boeing's philosophy, where prior to kind of the 1980s, it had been known for its pilot-first philosophy. So as a pilot with a Boeing plane, you felt that you were in control. During the 1980s, the American state engineered a merger between Boeing and a firm called McDonnell Douglas. McDonnell Douglas was very important to the US because it supplied the Department of Defense and Pentagon and the US military. So the state engineered this merger, said, Boeing, you're going to take McDonnell Douglas. And the culture of this firm became embedded in Boeing. And this was also the time of kind of shareholder value revolution. So Wall Street expecting you to deliver big profits. And Boeing really took this message to heart. It got a new CEO that basically said, screw the workers, screw the engineers. I'm going to put in layers and layers of middle management. Their role is to cut costs and make this company work as efficiently as possible, i.e. you're producing as much value as you can for the lowest possible price. They went to war with their unions, and they became a kind of darling of Wall Street in the process. They delivered astonishing profits until they delivered two planes that nosedived out of the sky and were found to have deliberately conspired to deceive the United States government. So when you hear that story, you think a classic case of corporate greed, of kind of people at the top exploiting workers and abusing their power. But what's fascinating about this story is the extent to which it was kind of a joint project between Boeing and the United States government. Because in 2018 and 2019, the years of these crashes, Boeing was the largest recipient of corporate welfare in the US. That's tax breaks, subsidies. The government was funneling money into this corporation to keep it alive. It was being regulated by the FAA, and the FAA had, thanks to successive rounds of regulation by Congress, moved to a philosophy of self-regulation. This was the same sort of regulatory philosophy that underpinned how the banks were regulated before the financial crisis. And the idea is basically no plane manufacturer is going to create an unsafe plane. It would damage its reputation, so we don't really need to regulate it. So at the time of the disasters, Boeing was being regulated by a unit of the FAA that sat in Boeing and whose workers were paid by Boeing. Massive conflict of interest, obviously. The other problem with this argument that they wouldn't manufacture a plane that was unsafe is that the market itself was highly uncompetitive. There are basically two firms that manufacture planes, Boeing and Airbus. And they're both very imbricated with their respective governments or international institutions. So the EU and Airbus have a close relationship. Airbus has been involved in corruption scandals. Boeing and the US government have an immensely close relationship. And all of this was very, very clear in the run-up to those crashes. But it was also clear after the crashes, because when the pandemic came about and Boeing was struck with declining orders because of the disaster that took place in the airline industry over that period, it got a massive backdoor bailout, despite having been found to have deceived the United States government by putting planes that were known to be unsafe onto the market. And ever since then, the United States government has basically continued to support this company. It has faced very little pushback for manufacturing these planes that have been found to have multiple very serious flaws. It hasn't been regulated properly. And basically, there's been no accountability. The whole idea of having a free market system is there are supposed to be immense amounts of accountability. Because if you do anything wrong, the competition will come in and undercut you, and then you'll be dead. And, in a kind of regulated social democratic society, where that role is not played by the market, for example, in areas where there's less competition, the government is supposed to be able to regulate these companies in the public interest. And instead, what we have are basically large, powerful corporations working together with financial institutions, with very powerful governments to protect their own interests and their wealth and power at the expense of the public interest. That is not a free market democratic system. That is an oligarchic, centralized system based on effectively what in any other nation we would call corruption.
And it sounds as if it sounds as if smaller companies, in a way, are also victims of this, right? Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a kind of interesting analogy for capitalism, which is that for most of us, for workers, for kind of small and medium-sized businesses, you have the law of the jungle. You do have a lot of competition. So the average worker is subjected to kind of immense competitive pressure over the course of their lives. And we're supposed to internalize this. We're really supposed to buy the idea that I am alone, I can only look after my own interests, and I have to kind of push everyone else out the way to get what I want. It's the same with kind of small business owners, like founders, etc. There's this kind of hustling and entrepreneurship that you think is kind of the lifeblood of what a capitalist economy is supposed to be organized according to. And that has pros and cons, right? It creates this kind of competitive individualistic spirit that devalues care, undermines our sense of community and belonging, creates all sorts of social and economic problems. But there is an argument for that kind of system because it also promotes efficiency, leads to allegedly a more efficient distribution of resources. The issue is that the most significant areas of the economy, the areas of the economy where most value is created, where most activity takes place, that's the biggest multinational corporations, the biggest financial institutions and governments, they aren't governed according to those principles. They mostly do not have to compete. They face very little competition, both because these large firms have grown up in sectors where they are able to kind of eke out quite a lot of market power, place kind of moats around their business, or they collude with one another. There's some fascinating research on basically collusion between large corporations, particularly in the US. But also over the course of the pandemic, there's this argument that firms basically tacitly colluded to use the inflationary environment to keep prices higher. Everyone thinks prices are rising, so they're more likely to accept a price increase higher than what they actually need
to put in place. So that's actually a big reason why we've seen such high levels of inflation. It's basically corporate greed, and they've been able to abuse their market power to do that. It's the same thing with, you know, financial institutions themselves, either colluding with one another or with the state, or working with, I've got a chapter looking at kind of collusion between financial institutions and corporations in which they've invested. And this was something that took place in everything from kind of, you know, the Enron scandal to WeWork. There are these kind of relationships that underpin the way that money is invested that, again, allow basically those in positions of power to avoid competition. And if all of that doesn't work, then these big, powerful corporations can just go knocking on the door of powerful governments and say, I need a bailout. And they generally get it. And even if they don't get it, then the government is going to be there to kind of, you know, smooth over any of the mess that's created, such that most really wealthy, important people in a capitalist economy know that they aren't going to have to face the downside of most of the decisions that they make. Whereas for the average person, you are very intimately acquainted with what the potential downsides of any decision that you are going to make, because you're not protected, but those at the top are.